Today's readings give us an opportunity to touch on the topic, the issue of sacrificial giving. Sacrificial giving is something I've heard Father Erickson mention on occasion, and I know that he will be encouraging sacrificial giving next weekend when we kick off our Together in Gratitude, Forward in Hope capital campaign. And while even the thought of sacrificial giving can be uncomfortable, I don't think it has to be unbearably so. And I couldn't resist telling a joke that that unfortunately some of you are probably familiar with. But it also gives me an opportunity to introduce a friend, a fictional friend I've used in my preaching as what I have thought was a relatively graceful way to add some levity from time to time into my preaching. And this fictional friend's name is Tex. So Tex has a small farm in Lake Elmo where he keeps some animals, a couple horses, some chickens, and some pigs. And I was visiting Tex fairly recently, and I noticed that in the yard that one of his pigs was running in circles around the chickens as if he was herding them, and it was rather extraordinary. And not only that, I noticed that this pig had a peg leg. A pig with a peg leg, very unusual. So I asked Tex about this peg-legged pig, and he said, "Oh, Father, that's Wilbur. That Wilbur there, he is an incredible pig. You'll never meet another pig like Wilbur. Just last month, I was in the kitchen fixing up some victuals, and I heard this squealing at the front door. So I opened the door, and there's Wilbur there making a racket. But then I noticed that there was smoke coming from the barn. So I ran over there, I grabbed the hose, and I put out the small fire that had started inside the barn. It was amazing that Wilbur, he's a real hero. He saved my farm, Father." And I was certainly very impressed with Wilbur, his herding and now his firefighting abilities. But I still didn't know why he had a peg leg. So I said, "Tex, that is an amazing story, and Wilbur certainly is an incredible pig, but why does Wilbur have a peg leg?" And Tex looked at me somewhat exasperated, and he shook his head and replied, "Father, a pig as incredible as Wilbur, you can't eat a pig like that all at once." So it seems our hero Wilbur will have a bit of a reprieve and live a bit longer than the average pig. But most pigs don't get such a break. You know, perhaps you've heard the saying about the difference between your average pig and your average chicken when it comes to your breakfast of bacon and eggs. The chicken makes a contribution to breakfast, but the pig doesn't just make a contribution. The pig makes a sacrifice, right? And I think this comparison between your average chicken and your average pig can help us to get at the essence of sacrificial giving. And our gospel passage certainly helps us in that regard as well. We're told that unlike the many other contributors to the temple treasury who gave from their surplus wealth, the poor widow contributed all she had, her whole livelihood. All she had, her whole livelihood. And certainly widows, and there's clearly widows among us today, that they have challenges. My own mother has been a widow now for six years, and I certainly recognize the challenges that that widows face in our time, but in biblical times and in biblical cultures, these widows were very vulnerable and had many challenges. They were not self-sufficient. Widows were dependent upon others and quite vulnerable, especially within that category of vulnerable people. The widows, even more vulnerable, were those who did not have an adult male son who was devoted to caring for them and protecting them. So that Jesus picks out and honors not a man and not even a woman, but a widow is very significant. This is a woman who is vulnerable. He praises her generosity. Her extreme generosity toward the temple treasury is an instance of sacrificial giving. Sacrificial giving is not taken from one's leftovers. Sacrificial giving is not taking from one's surplus wealth. In its purest form, it does not even just deprive a person of his or her wants or luxuries. Instead, sacrificial giving deprives a person of what he or she seems to need, of something that it at least seems to be in a real way a need. It's only by faith and trust in God to provide for our truest and most fundamental needs that we can imitate the sacrificial giving of the poor widow. And this is a big ask, and I wish that I was more generous. I wish I was as generous as this poor widow in the gospel. However, generous sacrificial giving is the challenge that Jesus sets before us today. I know that in a limited sort of particular way, Father Erickson will be delighted if you discern prayerfully that God is asking you to give sacrificially to our capital campaign. However, it's a significant but a limited aspect, right? Jesus challenged us to live generously and sacrificially in all aspects of our lives. And I can say this not only because Jesus praises this poor widow for her generosity, but Jesus himself lived a radically generous and sacrificial life, ultimately giving his life for us on the cross. And not only that, but he continues that generosity, right? He gives us the very gift of himself in his body and blood made present to us during the consecration and received in Holy Communion. So as we anticipate and prepare to receive Jesus' gift of his very self, may we be inspired by Jesus, the poor widow, and perhaps even some farm animals to give and to live sacrificially for God and neighbor.